Hello, welcome to the Realms Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 32, The Unbreakable Bond of Freedom and Tolerance, the emancipation of freedom through tolerance and other social liberties. This is a series of ruminations that I do once a week regarding work pertaining to my research and architectural practice. I am an architectural researcher in theory, generative strategy, and organizational structures. I'm also a draftsman and various other things. Anyway, so I started putting together these live streams to kind of be able to speak openly, freely, and easily about ideas that have kind of like permeated my work pretty much throughout my tenure. And as a result, I've kind of like started on another platform, but I kind of came here because I felt as if this was a reasonable place where I wasn't going to be hassled. Anyway, so this is a quick rundown. We started out with what to me is a very important idea, which is the operation of the metaphor. And I kind of broke that down into three parts, which was the organic metaphor, the artificial metaphor, and the unbreakable bonds of what I call the proto-metaphor or social metaphor. Now, what happened in those places was I explained what I believe is the proper origin of understanding of the metaphor. We think of it as a kind of like an artistic or kind of like a literary or kind of like a word-based kind of situation, when in fact I've come to understand or believe that in fact what it is a kind of like a natural process that basically has an analogy that we recognize and appreciate in our own literary and artistic work. But in fact, it's not it's not from that. It basically just kind of like reflects itself in that. From there, I talked about other things. I talked about the specifics of the organic metaphor, and then I compared that to the artificial metaphor, which is one that we basically understand the best. Then I talked about the proto-metaphor, or what I call an unbreakable bond, which is basically something that it's kind of like a societal marker that kind of we can identify as having purposefulness at a certain time. And I gave some examples of that. After that, I talked about the idea of the value of necessity of criticism, the art of finding what needs to be said, and a view of criticism an indicator of societal health. And then I started to identify something that I talked about later, which is the fact that once we establish these unbreakable bonds, we realize these are not permanent. These are things that we create because they have a consequence, they have a value. And by doing that, we kind of can also look back and see how we treat them and understand if this is a kind of progressive or kind of regressive, healthy or unhealthy aspect of society. And I think what happens is once we establish the criteria of something that has a consequence, we have a choice to either maintain it, improve it, replace it, or basically let it fall into decay, because the idea is we don't assume by nature that society is inherently progressive. We find that there are certain kind of imaginations that benefit, and also lack of imaginations that can basically be a deterrent. So we talked about that, and then we went into kind of architecture and started to talk about specifics. I talked about the idea of architecture as a process and a verb. I talked about drawing as a kind of inherent essence of what was the basic of visualization as a kind of key. Then I talked about and introduced the idea of organic architecture. Then, and this process was a process that basically for the first, I'd say, 26 episodes, followed the exact same number that I had put on the other previous ones, and then kind of went into that. After that, we talked about authority of ideas, and then we talked about my past architecture. I broke that down into it seems as if like there was a kind of like a trinity of three things to kind of talk about different purposes. I talked about my past architecture, which was my youth. My recent, past architecture which was my work as a student and as a professor. And then the aftermath or organic design thinking, which was basically after I had left teaching, because I felt as if the possibilities were limited in terms of philosophical development within any kind of community. After that, we went back to the idea of indicators of societal health, and we kind of focused on how that reflected on what we call the unbreakable bond, which is something we're talking about tonight because we have a specific case. Talked about an emotional attachment to ideas, understandings, and judgment. What is an unbreakable bond? What are important unbreakable bonds, and the importance of unbreakable bonds? So we really kind of went through how these kind of situations kind of pertain to any particular generation. We talked about, and I had talked about the idea of two important books for me. One was Alfred North Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, and the other one was The Revolt of the Masses by Ortega Gasset. And both of these trace the idea of particular circumstance leading to a situation that we could kind of see as a kind of like progressive Western identity. But then the facilitation or the kind of like maintenance of that was something that basically kind of we had to understand as something that was concern. So once we went from there, we started to realize that this idea is there's a kind of, in Ortega's language, there were two particular people. There was the person who kind of sees himself as having no inherent responsibilities, and then the man who basically takes as his responsibilities seriously and kind of develops those. And he kind of saw the highest particular responsibilities an individual could take would be those that pertain to the concept of the generation, that which is those things that were the inherent destiny of a particular group. And he kind of broke down the generation in his other work. He didn't do it in Revolt of the Masses. It was actually done by one of his students, Marius, who wrote the History of Philosophy, which is a pretty important book. But he also talked about, Ortega had alluded to it in several different pieces, but never really kind of went down to it. And it kind of, Marius actually made a point of like going in and actually specifying the specifics of it, basically taking it from Ortega. On the other hand, Whitehead talked about the ideas that make up civilization, but he kind of put out a warning saying this was how our civilization came about to create this situation. But this is a static sense, as it doesn't mean that that a return is simply to kind of like turn back and do the same things, that there were certain things that needed to be expected and appreciation that had to be identified within the circumstance. So in both cases, we understand the fact that the circumstance is something that had to be identified with. And for a person who doesn't see himself as having an accountability, this became problematic, which I think is actually one of the reasons why it's important to chart societal health. Then from there, we went specifically into traditions and cultures, the difference between a tradition and a culture. We talked about the fact that for me, the first thing that identifies a culture was the fact that conditions are put on subsistence and that we decide what those conditions are that we would feel want to be continued. So I felt that the first great creation of art was suicide, in the fact that it was the first time that someone said, these are the conditions under which I would continue or not. And I think that was a different, that kind of started to understand the fact that we understand this kind of like Darwinian compulsion, but there's a certain point where we start to say, we decide under what conditions we will continue. And I think that was something that for me has always been vitally important to identify and understand, the fact that there's not a given that we just would decide in any particular case that we would continue. And I talked about that in my own particular life, in terms of the fact that growing up as a child of the space race, and especially in Queens with the World's Fair and Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in 1969, for me, these things were incredibly particular in terms of the idea that this was the horizon of my destiny. The horizon of ideas, the horizon of imagination in 1969 for a 10-year-old boy living in Queens was quite huge. It was quite immense. It was maybe the greatest it had ever been. So the idea was a 10-year-old boy living in Queens felt that the possibility existed that he would also be able to be the first individual to stand on the surface of a planet. I mean, again, Neil Armstrong stood on the moon, which is basically not a planet; it's an orbiting body of the Earth. But the possibility existed that this one day, something that kings and queens and potentates and individuals of high power could only dream of, this was actually a reality for me. But then I realized that from there to the conditions that I would actually live through the Cold War and things like that, it was quite different to kind of see the kind of circumstance that I would inherit based on this incredible height of the imagination and the kind of height of dreams. So it was something that kind of was quite a bit of a shock. I mean, it was like to go from this idea of being able to kind of imagine that I would once, at the end of my life would be hurtling through space towards the horizon, going 100 kind of like 80 degrees from the place of my origin, and basically becoming the stardust from which I had come. This was a magnificent idea. This was something I think a lot of people of my age dreamed about. But unfortunately, the lack of conviction, the lack of courage, the lack of vision of the leaders of my nation and all nations basically took that ambition, that horizon of dreams, and squandered it, betrayed the people. Anyway, so from there we talked about the difference of what some of the principles of what was talked about with Whitehead in terms of how civilization kind of copes with or points towards the idea of a certain kind of way in which, at least in one case, things could come about. So I think in that case, we kind of started to see that. And he talked about the idea of truth, beauty, adventure, art, peace. Don't quote me. I think those were the 5 pieces that he talked about in kind of like in book 3. And I think what I did was I took truth, beauty, and I included love, which wasn't, but I kind of took that from Ortega and as a facilitator of these other 2. And then we talked about that, which brought us to the beginning of these newer pieces, because that was the first 26. And now what we are is we're on this new group, which I've just introduced, and that takes us up to the present day. Let me see what they are. I was thinking, I talked about entanglement and conditioning, and it was 2 specific things in my own work, and then kind of brought us up to today. So I kind of took a pretty long time to kind of recap, because I thought that I've been doing a kind of cursory recap, but now that we're kind of into a kind of like 33, 34 episodes, it's kind of important to kind of get a recap, so that way you kind of understand a little bit of where we've come from. So I talked about entanglement and conditioning. I talked about measurement, and these were 2 ideas that basically I feel are at the essence of my work, particularly. One being it's organic, it's the one being an organic one, and being an inorganic one. Then we talked about the nature of perspective within the metaphor, which was just a couple of weeks ago. Then we talked about understanding and judgment as regards authority, and that brings us to the unbreakable bond, or freedom and tolerance. So with that as a beginning, we're going to go to my favorite part of the live stream, which is This Week in Julie.
Is it really favorite? That's so nice.
Yeah, it is. I mean, because I get to listen. I mean, the thing is, we were talking with someone a couple weeks ago about the Saturday Evening Post and serials, and how certain things were kind of vetted out in parcels, and people had this anticipation of kind of waiting for the next installment. And I always loved that idea. Like comic books were that way. There were these kind of serials over time. And as much I was never like a comic book Batman, Superman, I always found those things incredibly trite. I did love the idea of a story that played out over time. And if you remember, I remember when you were kind of writing some of your, fables that kind of ended up in, the book, that it was enjoyable. Especially, I think the first one was Mortar and was the thing where I kind of couldn't wait to see the installments.
You
So
want to show the cover of the
yeah,
book?
let's show the cover of the book. But the thing is, like,
So that
so
people
for
know
this
what you're
part,
talking
even though I follow it because I see you in the studio every day, what I always love is kind of like listening to your recap. So, Bezawar Thirst by Julie Rower. It's available with Shakespeare.
Well, it was, but they closed all the Shakespeare companies.
Did
So,
they?
yeah. The one on the Upper East Side.
They still have one in
closed.
Soho, right?
It's not Shakespeare Company, no.
Oh no, it's McNally Jackson. McNally Jackson. Get it at McNally Jackson.
Have it, I don't think.
No?
Anymore. No.
What's wrong with them?
Well, it went out of print.
Okay, it's out of print. So get it on Amazon, I guess, or something. Or buy it from Julie.
Yeah.
You still have some copies.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I love about this book is there's an interesting kind of introduction by this, this guy. And he says, let me read it.
Yeah.
What separates the speculation of the scientist when he ventures beyond the line of what is alleged to be known, to pose a new formulation, and that of the writer who creates an image of a world beyond that which we believe to be our own? In my mind, very little, if anything, possibly nothing at all. I see these actions as simply two views of the very same thing. When the one individual crosses that line of what we believe we know with this conjecture, one is, in fact, proposing a new world, one that will be altered and shaped as a result of this new direction. As for the other individual, they have anticipated the conjectures, even though they may not have expressed them specifically. That must be, by necessity, take place in order for the world they anticipate to be as they see it. These two actions are inseparable, symbiotic. What differs is the point of view. The conjecture or speculation proposes alterations to the world we believe we inhabit, or the world that is imagined proposes the conjectures that are necessarily for that world to be so. Julie Rower many years ago proposed the term of speculist. This term was to describe the actions of people such as I have been describing, and as a result has brought under one heading the work of Feynman, Verne, Darwin, H.G. Wells, Einstein, and Shelley. It is in the tradition of the ideas of wanting to see deeper and understand what the depth of that insight means that the works of the speculist are wrought. Julie is neither scientist nor writer. Rather, she is someone who looks to the horizon of what we believe we know and asks what is beyond. Her meditations on these perspectives are what generate such artifacts as those contained within this volume. That was pretty cool.
You should show the back.
Oh, yeah. It's a very well done book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what's funny is people read it and they're like, I have no idea that language is like, just your language is so beautiful, but so intricately intense. It's like a Chinese puzzle. So, I mean, I think
interesting to watch them try to translate it into Chinese.
Well, they're trying to.
Yeah,
at the
they
head
actually
office.
are.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, it is like really a kind of an interesting puzzle. It's kind of, I feel as if like the way in which you craft language in these kind of, it's almost as if there's a series of kind of composite realities posed by these kind of huge, intricate, intertwined networks of metaphors. And in fact, I don't believe you probably express the operation of the metaphor in literature probably about as well as anyone ever has. And I think it's because you kind of see it as a component of the structure, not basically a kind of like anecdote added to language. And what I mean by that is that you actually kind of construct with these pieces, and then the interstitial places are kind of created in between them. But they kind of like are these things that kind of complicate and kind of like make intricate, complex weavings throughout the pages, as opposed to someone who just basically interjects it into a kind of like more kind of algorithmic structure. You're actually kind of composing them only as the structure itself. So what's new in Julie this week?
Oh,
this week in Julie.
I'm really not on the screen.
No, we'll move over.
I can't.
Yeah, you are.
Well, I was working at the Met on my drawing, the blueprint for my next painting. Thank you. and added the fourth mouse to the court jester. Um, it's a metaphorical portrait of a court jester to King Augustus II, one son of Augustus the Strong. Uh, it was obviously nothing like his father, who kept throwing jesters in prison and then having them executed. So, Baron, who was not a baron, it was quite a facetious title, Baron Schmiedel, not his actual name, was the court jester who was forced to basically be in the king's bedchamber, accompanying him on hunts. He was kind of there 24 hours a day to entertain a very fickle overlord who obviously was incredibly capricious in his punishments, because if a joke failed, they would basically be thrown in prison. So, he had four ostensibly trained mice who we all thought were his pets and his cherished companions, who turned out to be, he had a morbid fear of rodents, and they were very dependent on him for their livelihood as he was on them. So it's turned into quite a large size piece, much larger in scale than I usually work, because there is a very complex narrative and a wealth of detail. So I've also added the screech owl with its talons, with a disemboweled mouse, basically a portent of the future. So yeah, it's coming well. I think I only need 2 more sessions to finish it. And we're trying to figure out how to split it into a diptych or triptych.
Exactly. So that's good. Yeah, I think this was an interesting investigation, because you started out with the one drawing, and then you started to expand out off the page
quite a bit.
And then you found that, like, we looked at things like, changing the scale, and we realized that that wasn't a good idea, and because it was such a small change that it would kind of like just be distracting. I know it might have some interesting kind of correlations. We didn't really know what those would be, and it would kind of be like the happy accident.
Yeah.
So rather than that, because we're not the happy accident people,
we certainly are.
We're more the kind of thing is like, if we see a happy accident, the idea is like, what consequence could potentially be here?
Well, the idea of a scale shift too is, if it's too small, these components, which are very esoteric and nothing that is known to the viewer, would be almost unintelligible.
Okay.
I'll be right back. Hang on.
So let's go into
the scale or
So anyway, that coming up will be the drawing from which Julie will launch her next painting, and then that probably figure 3 or 4 months to kind of create that. So this is July, probably finished by the middle of July with the drawing, and then August, September, October, November. So by Thanksgiving, we actually might be, I'm saying by Thanksgiving, we probably would have that complete. That's exciting. Yeah, one of the things I've always enjoyed, in fact, I've started to really, again, as a draftsman, going to the Met and drawing from the pieces and then creating my own drawings of imaginary architectures. For me, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the fine art beauty of the piece, the drawing. And I guess I come from the tradition of Leonardo. I've talked about how he's my hero, and as much as these pieces that he makes are magnificent and beautiful, I think that for him, the investigation that took place while he was engaged in that particular drawing was for him more important than the result in terms of its consequence, beauty-wise or not. Now, I think for him, the exercise led to understanding, and that was the purpose. And for me, it's always been the same thing. Now, again, we get into this discussion a lot because a lot of my friends are kind of like highly focused on technique.
Mm.
And they always kind of, I always kind of say, I'm not advocating anti-technique. I'm just advocating pro-understanding. So that's kind of a back and forth that kind of goes on. And it's like, again, I have my own particular style, and a lot of my friends kind of have a certain envy for it. I never really completely understood that, but at the same time,
It's
I kind
very
of
masterful. That's why they're in.
no, I appreciate that. And again,
Yeah.
but I just look at it like, I think one of the things is, well, the reason why they may envy it is because I'm doing the thing that I'm going the opposite direction that they go, and it's actually
Yeah.
easier to get there than they
Mhm.
might assume.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Well, here's something that
say,
just came up.
uh,
So the adventures of information hunting is something I wanted to briefly talk about.
okay,
Um, in an age where people are incredibly jaded, excited by nothing, anticipatory
mhm,
of nothing, the idea of getting truly excited over the discovery of a piece of information is something that thrills me, and I believe us.
agreed,
I don't want to
agreed.
speak for you,
I agree.
but in my research for this new painting, which is called Gilded Terrors of a Court Jester, and I discovered a few things that are now a segue to another painting or drawing.
Oh, good.
Yes, which I believe I mentioned to Bruce, which is that I had added several metaphors. Is Baron Schmiedel's chest under his very lavish vest. All of his clothes are borrowed clothes given to him by the king, but underneath his vest is a grotto of fear, and the grotto are various animals and their prey in very visceral attack mode. And I wanted to add flora and fauna to this, and came up with which is what I think a very prescient, very damning metaphor for Baron Schmiedel's situation, which is the false morel mushroom, which is basically it's a doppelganger for something very wealthy, very sumptuous, very expensive, eaten by very few and the wealthy. And this particular one is gathered by all sorts of people who get horribly sick from it. Many lapse into a coma and they die. So I have a cross section of this now in my drawing, which it will be incorporated into the painting. But during my research on the various aspects and the chemical components of this particular incredibly toxic mushroom species, I discovered how many people hunt for different types of mushrooms, both culinary safe mushrooms. Do you remember I told you I discovered the peppermint plant?
No.
And that, in fact, was an indicator of the presence of matsutake or pine mushrooms.
Oh, I remember that.
So that investigation, I'll just finish up really fast, leads me to the next painting may well be a portrait of a matsutake mushroom hunter armed with the plants that only grow at the base of the pine tree.
Oh, I do remember that.
Which is how people literally find them.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, they are an obligate parasite that only feeds off the mycelial root structure of the pine tree.
Which actually was part of the component argument. It was a component of the argument you made at the Jeffersonian Table Talk, which basically had people very enamored of what you kind of had ideas about and relates to artificial intelligence, which we go back to another time.
Sure.
But
anyway,
I kind of added this like on the 3rd of August. We're going to be talking about the loss of 2D design.
Oh, that's
okay.
Really
so that's
good
something I
title.
really need you to. I mean, it's kind of probably that'll be something you'll do. Maybe in fact you'll do that piece, and I'll basically you can ask me like this week in Bruce or something. But
Sure.
I think that you will play a big part in that, because I think that's something we've talked about. But let's start thinking about that now, because that's kind of part of a lot of these pathologies.
That was my graphic design career.
Yes,
I mean, that's
yes.
I have a lot to say about that.
Exactly. Anyway, so with that said, and we're right on time at 30 minutes. Let's kind of talk briefly. Let's get into our main topic here, which is the emancipation of freedom through tolerance and other social liberties. And what we'll do is we'll talk about freedom, tolerance, liberty, and the relationship of tolerance in another unbreakable bond, which is a relationship of tolerance with strength, which is something that kind of is a very important part of this whole discussion. Anyway, in previous talks, I've talked about the idea of the confusion that often takes place when people talk about freedom in the kind of social sense, and people say we need freedom, and don't understand that there's a kind of what I would call a social definition of freedom, and a kind of like what I would call an ontological or metaphysical idea of freedom. And the difference would be that the freedom in the philosophical kind of ontological sense is that idea of being immersed in a situation when one has to force to choose between the directions and the objects and the issues that contend to a life. So one is constantly immersed in that drama, that process. So that's what I would call freedom. And I think what we mean when we really say freedom in the social sense, what we're talking about is social liberty, is the ability to kind of like exercise certain kind of parameters, certain things. We're allowed to kind of engage in certain things, the ability to speak, the ability to move, the ability to kind of autonomy. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I think we want to kind of distinguish. So that when I say freedom and tolerance, I think the reality is that is kind of talking about the philosophical freedom and the social idea of tolerance, or the social idea of some of these other social liberties that kind of come down to us from other places and kind of sift through the Enlightenment to the time that the founding fathers put together the Constitution and the various different component structures of this country of America.
Very appropriate for the
4th of July.
Yeah, for
yes.
the 4th of July.
249th birthday of the greatest country maybe in the history of civilization. Certainly could make the play for it. Certainly could kind of contend for it. I think that there's just the fact that we are and still remain, the only culture that has ever put a person on the body of another planet, and being able to kind of do it repeatedly. Though unfortunately, as a result of what I talked about before, we don't presently have the ability to do it now, which I think is one of the great failures and one of the great kind of like shows of cowardice in leadership. I mean, which is, I think, why I believe that JFK was the greatest leader that ever existed in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And the rest of them were all just cowards. But I mean, I think between it, could be incompetence, could be fear, could have been a lot of things. But I mean, the fact that we didn't by this time do as we kind of had imagined and had a permanent base on the moon, in space, on Mars, and that the things off the planet were as important, if not more, than the things on the planet. While at the same time, the things on the planet seem to kind of like fester and kind of fall into disrepair.
If FDR were here, we'd be back on the moon.
If FDR was here, and LaGuardia was still, here. We probably have a moon base in Queens.
Probably, yeah.
We probably have
they actually had vision and they acted on it.
Yeah, no, it's true, very true.
Well, there's the very quick famous story about Teddy Roosevelt. He was giving a speech. Most people do not know this, and he was shot.
Really?
Very, very severely. It was an assassination attempt, and it didn't kill him. He was bleeding profusely. He continued with his speech for over an hour. He refused to let it stop him, and only afterwards did he even go for a treatment. I believe the bullet was always in him, that was never really taken out. I mean, that's tough.
He was a person of incredible fortitude. Yeah. And I think, what happens is sometimes that you get so immersed in ideas that, your kind of passion for expressing these ideas kind of like overcomes all these other things.
I learned about that at the Roosevelt House.
Oh, nice. So at the same time, though, we understand the fact that one can be passionate about expressing ideas, but one cannot get emotionally attached to ideas. And that was something that we spoke
Sorry, that
about.
was just a small segue.
No, it's cool. So anyway, so we talked about freedom being that component of our kind of reality, to be able to kind of have to contend with those circumstances that we kind of find ourselves uh, enmeshed in, and inescapable. So that's the kind of thing. Do I cross the street? Do I take this course? Do I understand that my life has meaning? Am I involved in a search to understand that, to appreciate that, to further that? These are the things that kind of constantly are imposed upon us by ourselves and by life.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of come to kind of see that. One of the things I feel that has been an unbreakable bond that has served individuals tremendously in the West, and especially since the Enlightenment, has been this idea of the connection of freedom and tolerance. That the idea is to tolerate the individual freedom of others to the degree that that allows that individual to emancipate that freedom to its greatest degree. So that bodily autonomy, social liberties, these things allow us to kind of engage to the greatest degree rather than be inhibited by these kind of impositions societally. So I think that, to me, is the kind of thing that we must be watchful of. Because again, the state, in whatever form it is, communist, socialist, uh, democratic, or otherwise, that idea to impose against that authority of the individual is something we might to be watchful of. So, one of those things that kind of most becomes identifiable is that idea of the sovereignty of the body. Now, what was interesting is the fact that, like, for me, it's always been clear that when people say, abortion is a woman's issue, it's not a man's issue. And it's not that I don't see a value in that statement. I just disagree on the fact that the bigger issue is the idea of bodily sovereignty.
Yeah.
And I always explain, you can say this person is murdering this or this person is doing that. But my attitude is just the same way that we could have an embassy of a Belgian embassy in New York City, so that at this building, it actually becomes the sovereign property of Belgium, not America or New York City. So that the rules within this, once you cross this line, don't pertain to you anymore because you're now entering another sovereign territory. For me, the woman's body and any individual's body is their sovereign territory.
Oh, it should be.
So they constitute the law within that domain.
They should be their own law.
Exactly.
And only their own
Exactly.
law.
So the point
And
is,
no one else should
exactly.
have any say.
So if in the United States, this is considered murder to take the life of an unborn, to take the life of a child, that child exists outside the woman's body and therefore exists in the domain of America. Now, to kill a child is murder.
Yeah.
Right? But to kill a child within your body is your choice, just the same way that I could commit suicide. So it is my body. So the point is, that domain does not belong to the United States. It belongs to me. So therefore, it's not specific. It is something that women have to contend with, but at the same time, it does have implications on the idea of universal bodily sovereignty, as far as I'm concerned. So the idea is, I protect that right for women, not selfishly because it pertains to me, but only because it is the bigger universal principle that includes me as well.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Which is also why, the idea is, no one can take from my body. Sound like fireworks. No one can take from my body. Like the sense of, like, now, again, if I break a certain law, and the law is such that the state can punish me and take away, say, my ability to reproduce, or affect my brain. This is something I can kind of argue. But the point is, that's something that we contend with in our discussions about society.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a different issue. Now, also, kind of like what is also important is understand the difference between tolerance and strength. Now, the reason why tolerance has to be linked to strength is the fact that, in a sense, where an intolerant individual, kind of comes against you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the idea that tolerance is not kind of like unconditional. There are conditions on tolerance. And the point is, those conditions are the point where someone has to maybe possibly impose strength to basically become, so one doesn't have to be kind of like submitted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the idea is without strength, your ability to kind of like fight against an enemy who has a kind of like a greater ability, it doesn't matter. If someone is tying you to a chair and they don't care if you want to be tied to a chair or not, you being agreeable or not is irrelevant. So the point is that strength basically says, under these conditions, my tolerance is withdrawn. And this is also something that I see as a kind of circumstantial reality, given the fact that there are people who are looking for tolerance, but at the same time are not willing to extend tolerance. So I've seen the necessity for this situation where one has to be able to be very clear as to the conditional aspect of that.
Can I
Yes.
get back
Yes,
around
yes,
to something
yes.
that you said
Mm-hmm.
earlier?
Mm-hmm.
You had said that which is vital has been taken away,
Mm-hmm.
and that which is most important is now at the greatest peril of vanishing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a painting on precisely that. I don't know
Oh.
if you remember Chatelaine for Anxious
Days. Yes, I
which
do
is
remember that.
something I'd like to
Yeah,
bring.
let's bring it in.
Yeah,
Let's bring it in
that's
because
what
we're
I
getting
was
to the point
getting.
where we're
Yeah.
getting to final remarks.
Well,
We're at
yeah,
the point,
but I
so
think
we'll get.
that
Let's get. Yeah, this will be
that
perfect.
has everything to do with what you were talking about.
Exactly. No, that's really good.
the point.
So the premise is understanding and appreciating the fact that in a country with the rule of law and with a constitution.
You haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, no, I haven't. This is a magnificent piece.
1/27/2020 COVID. And that has everything to do with this piece. So this is my painting titled Chatelaine for Anxious Days. And I completed it on January 27th, 2020, in the middle of COVID, when the Met was shut down and everything of consequence was stripped away from all of us. And that was precisely the subject of this painting, which was conceived and begun before all of that. So since I saw it coming and felt like Cassandra because I could do nothing to stop it.
You said something that was very, very ominous and very, very important.
Yes.
When I started to feel a certain amount of kind of relief at the fact that it seemed as if COVID itself was no longer the ogre it had been. You said your concern wasn't COVID. No, say that.
My concern was not so much COVID as the human response to COVID.
Which to me was very, very prescient in what we're talking about.
People handled it atrociously. They destroyed people's lives.
I say criminally.
Oh, criminally.
Without a doubt.
I mean, their handling of it, their opportunism, they bankrupted everyone. They drove people to suicide, a lot of suicides, totally unreported. But the point is, these closures were happening at the same time that they didn't protect those people who really needed protection. And what was happening and how it was handled by the government, how it was handled by the people in charge was atrocious. and it helped
It was
nobody.
tyrannical.
It was tyrannical. It was barbaric. It was like something out of a bad science fiction film. And
Only
I
it was
love
real.
science fiction, but this was not good
No,
science
it was only
fiction.
real.
Yeah.
You know, and in fact, one of the things I felt was that the ideological kind of footprint was the only thing of concern, and
Yeah.
any kind of residual or kind of like, you know, kind of collateral damage was irrelevant to these people.
Well, the collateral damage far outstripped
absolutely,
the
but it was
actual.
incredibly the callousness
Oh,
which
yeah.
with which they dismissed the collateral damage was disgusting.
Yeah, there were people jumping off their balconies,
Yeah,
throwing themselves
I mean,
out of
nobody
windows.
concerned themselves.
I
They
mean,
just basically said, we're going to do this because we've decided this is what's best. And the other thing is now, you know, that the sternness and the confidence and the preachiness that we saw, we now come to understand it was all bullshit.
Yeah,
And they
it
basically
was.
were lying to us, and they really didn't understand. And
No,
you know, we came to understand things and see things that were completely lies.
we
And then
were
the whole
told a pack of lies.
Fauci scandal, when he kind of basically kind of said,
it's gain of function research.
well, yeah, but I mean, yeah, exactly. But the idea that he would make these claims that no one ever thought that there was ever the potential for it being a lab leak, and that people had their careers stifled and kind of destroyed because they basically were telling what we knew was indeed the truth. And then Francis Collins' desire to kind of like shut people down because they basically were saying something that went against everybody. Oh yeah, it was disgusting. To see Jay Bhattacharya basically come out on the top of this is, you know, considering the fact that from what people have told me, he's a very honorable man and he's a very good person. And
actually is still, you know, writing books about how great he is and sponsoring films to, you know, making himself out to be a hero. Yeah, well, I mean, people.
Fortunately, you know, more people saw AOC's film than yeah, you know, maybe they went to each other's film. Double the audience size.
It's true. I should describe what a chatelaine is, because I think it's incredibly important, and it's one of those terms, and we should have a show about this, about lost objects, lost artifacts that are incredibly relevant now. And if people knew about something, and it might seem like an esoteric point, it would change the way they organize information.
And we could contrast that with the retro transposons, which actually work in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Cool. And this is a term I think many people are going to thank us for introducing them to, I hope. A chatelaine is a tool belt almost exclusively for women, because women who were denied their civil liberties, their social rights, their reproductive rights,
their bodily sovereignty
were denied pockets. Yes, you heard me correctly. Pockets in their clothing. For centuries,
they still don't have them.
We still don't have them. I mean, if I could just wear a giant pair of cargo pants that started at my neck and ended at my ankles, yes, I'd say a cargo tunic. But the point is, women had no pockets, and we needed places to put things. Men's clothes always had pockets. They still do, by the truckload. Mm-hmm. So a chatelaine, and this in my painting is a Tiffany sterling silver chatelaine that was on view at the Met. It is not on view now. It's in their permanent collection in the American wing. This is from, I think, 1885 or 1887, was a massive tool belt, and they own many chatelaines. So those are sterling silver chains upon which dangled all of those tools that were essential for everyday life. And this is something that I think speaks to all of us in the audience now. What would your chatelaine be? What would you hang from your chatelaine? I saw everything Bruce and I held dear being pulled out from under us with no rhyme or reason. I mean, it turns out closing the museum, simply put everyone out of work and made these institutions close. A lot of them closed, never to open up again.
Mhm.
And if people had just simply taken some very rational precautions, none of that helped. None of that stopped the spread of COVID. I mean,
it was never about COVID.
It was never about that. But anyway, I took all of the tools. Now, a chatelaine normally would have tools like the keys to the house, a vinaigrette, which actually is not to be put on salads. It contained smelling salts because women were trussed up like turkeys and they fainted all the time. It had to be resuscitated. They had knives, they had letter openers, they had keys, uh, change belts, things of that sort, tweezers, because everyone had a lot of hair.
Right.
So I replaced all of those with a symphony tool. There is a reliquary tool. Mine turns into a miniature forest, a place to stroll, a place to contemplate when the human world has failed you. A symphony tool, a koi pond tool, and a bento box tool. All the restaurants were shut down, and no one anticipated the death of fine food. I mean, it's never come back. No one is cooking experimental food because they don't have the clientele. They don't have the money to open a restaurant that serves interesting things.
And for a long time, you couldn't even get materials.
Yeah,
you couldn't even get ingredients.
Even get raw ingredients.
In fact, we had one of the things that was really sad was after COVID was there was
sushi, right?
there was no, well, that too, but I was talking about like we found our way back to what had been one of our favorite restaurants, only to watch it suffer because it was incapable of getting the ingredients that made it such a special place.
Yeah, it was tragic.
And it was tragic, exactly, because
singular.
It was very singular, and it's still around, and it's out now. We hear about the fact that it is starting to kind of have a certain amount of resurrection,
but it's not what it was.
No, because what happened was, and again, one of the things that I think goes back to what I was saying about Ortega and the Revolt of the Masses was the fact that there is a need to understand the fact that the organizational structure with which society presents itself at any time is not a given. And that one of the things I think we learned, because so many people have kind of lived in kind of privilege and opportunity, that they think that this will always be there, and it was just there, and it just kind of is taken for granted. It's an incredibly naive, ignorant thing to believe that a society like the United States, with its incredible complexity and intricacy, just happened by accident.
It did not.
No, of course not. But I mean,
it was planned.
Right.
It was right.
Exactly. I mean, it was something that took right. But again, it was like it was something that was engineered over like 100 years
and cultivated.
Exactly. But again,
on working.
For 249 years, we went from a ragtag bunch of colonies to, the most powerful civilization maybe that has ever existed. But again, this didn't happen by mistake. And it didn't happen by accident or coincidence. No, there were people who made sensible decisions. There were people who had good, solid plans. There were people who kind of forged good universal principles that still have consequence. Now, the fact that we're kind of like losing our focus and kind of like somewhat, kind of misled at the moment is a testament to the fact that I think we've forgotten the fact that this organization that we built needs to be maintained, but it needs to be understood. One of the things I've proposed is a kind of secretary of engineering or secretary of architecture, engineering, and planning as a post in a cabinet. Because one of the things that the Los Angeles fires showed me is the fact that one of the most important things to do is to be able to understand how to have a viable, robust infrastructure.
Oh, yes. Infrastructure is the bedrock.
Given the fact that, America, the United States sits in a place that is fairly volatile in terms of weather. And I mean, to be serious about the fact that there are, conditions in the climate that change over time. My question is, are there any things, given the climate circumstances that are kind of changing, are there any of them that cannot be simply engineered? So the question is, I do not doubt, I totally understand the fact that the impact of humans on society has basically had an effect on the climate. So the question is,
Mm-hmm.
what potential hazards do not have engineering solutions?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Yeah. So the thing is, this is something that should become, so here's the first thing. I mean, because I think there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of nonsense regarding, climate catastrophe, global boiling, and all this stupid nonsense. But the reality is, if we are serious,
Yeah, there are actually really serious
here's
things
the
happening.
thing. We are probably in a position that the engineers, architects that exist today are probably as consequential and as capable as has ever been in history.
Look at the Netherlands.
Well, yeah, but I'm
I
saying
mean,
even in the Netherlands, in more primitive engineering times,
Mhm.
they had the ability to understand and appreciate how to make these things
oh, they're
and have engineering
outstanding
solutions.
in their
So the point is,
engineering,
the engineering solutions
Mhm.
are where I would put my point and
Yeah.
where I would put my time and say, hey, what engineering solutions do we have to basically understand and appreciate these things? I mean, I
Mhm.
find that if I was an architect or an engineering dean, right, I would basically say, how do I put this into my curriculum? How do I prepare my young students who
Mhm.
I'm training to be the next generations of great architects and engineers? How do I prepare them to think about this problem?
Mhm.
Right? So that these are the kind of thesis projects I see when I go back to review and we go back to City or any Columbia or any of those
Mhm.
places and see these solutions. So like, hey, since we're all concerned about this, we're all
Mhm.
concerned about sustainability. Where's the organic component in architecture? Where's the engineering solution to some of these concerns? If we're looking at temperature, sea level, ice sheets, we're looking at all these potential things that are in flux. I mean, climate is always in flux. There's no such thing as a stable climate. I mean, that's one of the things I think I appreciate by reading Whitehead is the fact there's
Mhm.
no such thing as a stable circumstance. Things change, things become, and things disappear. But the
Mhm.
idea is, how do you manage that process? Anyway, so that's
Mhm.
kind of like, any last words, P, before we kind of go off?
Yes,
Okay.
an organic component in architecture, I believe, I posit,
Hmm.
is far more than some of the trappings of green buildings, so-called green
Yeah.
buildings. Like putting a roof of grass or wildflowers is beautiful and it does serve a purpose. It serves several aside from
Mhm.
beautiful aesthetics, the attraction of
Mhm.
birds and insects and
Mhm.
pollinators.
Mhm.
It does serve to moderate the temperature and it does various other things. However, it is a fairly superficial approach versus how do you architect and engineer an underground mycelial structure that communicates between buildings, like fungi, are the arbiters of communication of trees in a forest. So, how do you engineer and make a mycelial structure that allows buildings, which would seem like these trees and the fungi, unrelated on the surface of the ground, have a robust and long lived connectivity and communication?
Hmm.
Mm,
That's a great way to leave it.
thank
Perfect.
you.
Can't do better than that. So
Thank you.
next week we're going to be talking about value and consequence. Basically, there's, in my case, there's synonyms.
I love cinnamon,
There's synonyms.
especially
But
in
I mean, I
buns.
think the idea is we kind of need to talk about that in relation to other issues. So
Mhm.
the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you, and we'll see you
Amen to
soon.
that.